Okay, groovy. So, as I said on Facebook, apologies that this is being recorded rather than live streamed, but certain things are unavoidable. Seemed better to do it this way rather than rely on an unreliable internet connection where I don't know whether it's going to kick out. So some people have sent me specific questions, which hopefully I'm going to cover while I'm discussing some of the other material. And hopefully there's not too much noise. It does seem to be there's some kind of extreme weather event, though not as extreme as elsewhere in the world, I guess, happening outside. So first and foremost, this is a requested workshop. So people got in touch with the Scottish Heroes training team and said we'd really like to do, we'd really like there to be a workshop on deputy speeches. This is often a position that's neglected in terms of people discussing workshops, in part because it tends to be folded into discussions that take place about how to do opening government on the one hand and opening opposition on the other hand. There are definitely cases where considerations of what is best from a DPM point of view versus a DLO point of view are considerably different, and so there are certain points at which I'll be discussing one rather than the other, but there are things that are generalizably true, I think, of both. I'm not sure whether this workshop will go a full hour. It may not. There might just not be enough to say on deputy speeches to go a full hour, but it will include a number of examples. So one thing I'll try to do is include links to the example speeches of what I think are either very good deputy speeches. I think all the examples I'm discussing are very good deputy speeches, but more importantly are examples of different ways to approach deputy speeches or different features of deputy speeches that deputy speeches could take. The second note that I think is preliminary, but I should probably get out of there so it's not an elephant in the room. This is very much a do as I say, not as I do workshop, which is to say that especially those who will have seen me speak in the immediate run-up to Vienna Euros might be aware that after a number of failed experiments with me speaking deputy, I switched back to speaking Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition. The reason for this is my making what I think is the second mistake, which I'm going to list in terms of 3 mistakes that people make from deputy speeches, and seemingly be unable to correct for this. I will include some advice along the way of how to try and avoid making some of these mistakes, but it might just be that you find, especially in more competitive rooms, that there are certain perennial problems you're facing that mean that you tend to lose debates more often than not when you're speaking deputy as opposed to speaking opening. And I think it's a sensible thing to respond to that. And certainly I think after I switched, I could be mistaken about this, but I think this is accurate. When I did switch back to speaking first for Vienna Euros, Chris and I didn't actually lose a top half debate. No, that's wrong. There's at least one where we lost. But be that as it may, seemed to be a sensible decision. So I think the first thing probably to discuss is one of the key differentials in terms of models of deputy speeches that people encounter, especially if they've come from the school circuit, where issues of splitting between speeches are very much to the fore. So a lot of the discussion that this within this workshop is going to presume an approach that maybe you'll be familiar with, the fact that I favour if you've seen any of my other workshops on strategy at all, which is front-loading of material. So more material packed into the first speech, maybe at the cost of under-analysing it. Obviously, the more you do it, the better you get at trying to hone to the more important, more fundamental parts of the analysis. So hopefully they can be delivered as important points. But the thought being that if you front-load material, you actually give the second speaker, the deputy speaker in the case of top half, the summation speaker in the case of bottom half, more strategic options as to what to do with that material. So more options in terms of dealing with the other teams. And you can to some extent win over those other teams by exhaustion if the second speaker can handle the approach to that material quite well. So I think that's the key benefit, I would say, in terms of front-loading. And a lot of the strategic considerations that this workshop will discuss will be primarily presuming a high degree of front-loading in terms of material, although we will discuss options for the deputy speeches that don't do that. As far as splitting, if you were determined to split material, which is to say, if you're determined, and some people do this, and they've been very successful doing this, so it's not necessarily a bad idea, it's just not one that I favour. So when I say splitting, for those that aren't aware, it's going into prep and saying, well look, this argument is going to go in the deputy speech, this argument is going to go in the Prime Minister's speech, or the Leader of Opposition speech. Now, that is an approach that, as I said, is very much favoured within the schools circuit, and particularly within people that have done world schools, because it's very much a standard feature of that format. There is, if you are going to do this, one rule that is worth bearing in mind, which is you cannot have a hung case, which is say that you cannot have a case whereby there isn't sufficient argumentation in the first speech to justify doing the policy. It's quite difficult to get your head around that to some extent without an example, although all examples will sound a bit strange. So it's very rare to actually encounter a properly hung case, but an example of that might be this. Suppose you were in debate about whether or not teachers should be paid more for higher performance. Suppose the Prime Minister, for whatever reason, spent 7 minutes explaining that teachers are underpaid, and this is very sad. And it's not until the Deputy Speaker they get an argument that said, well, and teachers should be paid more, and they'll respond to this positively, or words to the effect. What has happened there is the Prime Minister hasn't actually given any arguments, or hasn't given sufficient argumentation to actually do the policy. There isn't a cohesive reason to do the policy, or in the case of analysis debates, to believe the proposition coming from the first speaker. You need some of those arguments coming from the second speaker to have a cohesive case. Now, this is different from having a good case, right? It's obviously there are debates in which the Prime Minister will give a comprehensive set of reasons to do the policy, which are all very bad. But nonetheless, that would not be a hung case. However, if there's just insufficient reason in and of itself to do the policy on the basis of the things that the Prime Minister says, that would be a hung case. And that is not allowed under the rules. Although given the rarity of actually encountering this, I'm not actually sure how many. It might be a bit like the offside rule in football. I'm genuinely not sure how many judges, even if they're, say, chair judges of an international competition, could actually tell you what a hung case is. But certainly if you are thinking about splitting, worth bearing in mind you need to have a complete case in the first speech. It can't just be that some of those arguments are waiting for arguments coming out in the second speech. So in terms of talking about models, we'll think of the very basic model first. So in terms of what should you teach freshers when you're explaining to them what a deputy speech is? I think the most straightforward model for a deputy speech, and it's probably good as a kind of training wheel to get used to the idea of what the speech is supposed to do, is to have a split of the speech into thirds. So 1/3 is rebuttal, 1/3 is rebuilding, which is say engaging with the reasons that the team on the other side have given to reject the arguments made by the first speaker, and 1/3 is extending, so giving new reasons for the policy, or I guess against the policy if you're opening opposition. Now, in practice, and indeed when we're thinking about all the other things that this workshop is going to discuss, it is highly likely that you will depart from that very strict model, because obviously different considerations, depending on the context, will cause you to favour one or other of those approaches. So in terms of talking about very basic models for deputy speeches, we'll be discussing these in a lot more detail as we go on. But I think the two core models of, I guess, good deputy speeches, there's probably lots of models for bad deputy speeches, but the two core models are for, say, a deputy speech to be a second half, as it were, of the Prime Minister's speech, of the LO speech, by which I mean it is providing additional reasons to do the policy with a degree of responsiveness to the team on the other side. So I think good examples of this approach, if you want to look at examples of it, would be, say, speeches given by Michael when he's speaking with Ashish at the HWS round robin in 2015 and 2016. So again, I'll try and provide links for some of these example debates, but the debate about Israel in 2015 and the final in the 2015 HWS round robin and the 2016 round about filial responsibility, I think these are all good examples of a deputy speech which seeks to build upon the arguments made by the Prime Minister. You can see them as being providing extension material, or you can just see it as almost coextensive with the Prime Minister's speech, and almost a kind of 14-minute Prime Minister, where we're providing additional reasons in the second speech to continue. Another good example, and probably I guess the classic example, would be the Deputy Prime Minister's speech in the 2012 World's Final. So that's Amit Golder from Monash. A lot of people consider that to be maybe one of the best deputy speeches that are recorded, but it's not necessarily a deputy speech where they're doing anything you would consider to be, I guess, summative from the second speech. A lot of the core analysis that ends up winning them the debate comes out in the deputy speech in that debate. I guess in similar fashion, although this one is a bit painful, You could look to the Deputy Prime Minister's speech in the 2014 Chennai final as well as being a similar example, where having had good examples coming from the Prime Minister's speech of what kind of policies they like to implement, Ben Smirkaiser in the Deputy speech then adds a number of examples to that, and by doing so contributes to the scale of their case. By contrast to this, the other model would be approaching the Deputy speech as a summation of the top half. Obviously, particularly prominent there in DLO speeches by virtue of the fact that the whole top half has happened by that point, and that's where one of the strategic differentiations between OG and DPM on the one hand and OO and DLO on the other hand fundamentally lie. But you could see the Deputy Prime Minister speech equivalent of this as being the speeches that focus more on rebuttal and less on extensions, more on metrics for why the opening government case should win. Dear me. More on metrics for why the opening government case should win, and less on trying to provide additional reasons for doing the policy or additional reasons for believing whatever the analysis debate claim is. Now, which is more important will presumably depend on a couple of factors. I think probably one is who you were trying to beat, so where you think the key threat lies. And this is why sometimes the strategic approach taken by teams in outrounds will be slightly different, non-terminal outrounds will be slightly different from the strategic approach taken within in-rounds, because obviously if you are in a semi-final or a quarter-final or indeed a partial double octo final, you only really need to beat two of the other teams. So a lot of the time it can be more in your interest than it might be in, say, an in-round or a final, if you're the opening opposition team, to make absolutely certain you're knocking out the opening government team, because that might be enough to make sure that you've gone through the next round. So that may be one reason why teams might favour the summative approach in non-terminal outrounds as opposed to trying to extend material to make sure that they're beating their closing team. And second, how well the first speaker has done their job. We'll discuss this from a practical point of view later, but it does affect the strategic calculus in terms of what you need to do as the deputy. And certainly the more flexible you can be in your approach, and the more critical, but maybe not saying critical things to them, the more critical you can be in terms of your partner's performance, the better positioned you are to make those kind of determinations as to what you should do with that speech, and it will change what kind of approach is best. So the next section of this discusses deputy speeches relative to three aims, which I guess you could consider to be mirroring of some of the things we've said already. The three aims that I'll be discussing are: one, stealing extensions from the closing team; second, providing judges reasons to knock out the team opposite; and third, deepening the analysis from the opening speaker. And obviously there's a degree of overlap between 3 and 1, but we'll discuss different things under those headings. Just a little bit of additional discussion that's preliminary to that. So it's worth remembering that a lot of the framework for the debate as a whole comes from the first speaker, which is to say what your case is fundamentally about, and the model, or indeed counter-model, and the definition or counter-definition comes from the first speaker, and to some extent can only come from the first speaker. Judges very rightly get squeamish about significant definitional work coming out of the deputy speaker. So one question that's often asked is there actually a way around this? Is there a way to solve for the problem of, oh dear, my partner's duffed up and hasn't necessarily done what I thought they were going to do, or hasn't necessarily clarified the model in a way we wanted to be clarified? I think, and this is one of those ones where we're trying to explain how to get around the rules, so this might be one of those things that's plugged by a subsequent set of judge briefings, so don't necessarily rely on this always to be the case. But in my experience, judges tend to be much more flexible when it comes to people pointing to status quo examples of the policy being implemented, or trying to appeal to the notion of common sense. The idea being that people are squeamish, rightly so, about someone providing a clear addition to the model to solve a problem raised by opening opposition in a way that they aren't to a speaker saying, well, look, I mean, we understand that can be a problem, but, there's various ways that different people have solved for that in the past. So when this was implemented in Germany, for example, it was done on a rotation, for example. Or alternatively, saying, pointing, for example, saying, well, look, okay, we appreciate that can be sometimes difficult to define, but really that's kind of what the courts are for. Courts all the time make those kind of difficult decisions between, how you should pick between two different competing options, and we think the courts can definitely do that in this case. So the difference between that and providing a clear addition to the model that the Prime Minister has added is that you're really just pointing to common sense ways that the problem would be solved in practice. No one can be expected to cover literally everything about the implementation of a policy in the first speech, and therefore the more you can present this as, well, look, we're playing the game fair and square, they're not to the judges, the more likely you're going to get away with potentially significant clarifications to the model. One thing you should never do is approach the debate with doing that in mind, right? We will be discussing traps that you can lay to some extent later on, but this should not be one of them, right? It's always a risky bet to hedge your case on the other team wasting time discussing a gap in your model and then say, well, look, here's how we could solve that gap. Not a good idea, but there are ways in which you can try and solve for that problem by pointing to status quo instances of implementation or just common sense ways in which you could solve some of the problems raised by opening if your partner has kind of duffed up and not said something they should have, or possibly you as a team messed up and didn't discuss some of those aspects. So the first aspect we said to discuss is stealing extensions from closing. So I think the easiest way to approach this in terms of if you're actually doing it as a speaker is basically approach it in the same thought process as if you were extending. So what are new avenues that you want to take the debate down? Classic examples of this working out quite well for teams, the Deputy Leader of Opposition in the Court Quarrels final, where a lot of the discussion of practicality issues doesn't really come out at all until the practicalities of the ban on abortion in the Court Quarrels final is they decided to ban abortion, opening opposition end up winning. Primarily, I believe, although presumably there are people I could ask, and I just haven't asked this yet. Primarily, I believe on the basis of the practical arguments that come out in the deputy speech, the principled arguments being relatively well clashed with by the closing government team. The Deputy Prime Minister in the Manila Octo, which is a debate that we'll come to again, more looking at what the Deputy Leader of Opposition does in that debate. But if you're watching that debate anyway, in order to watch the Deputy Leader of Opposition speech when I recommend it, best to skip back and watch the DLO as just a classic example of them having run a good case in the Prime Minister's speech and in the Deputy speech say, aha, and also internationally as a means of just extending the material. And you can see the same kind of move done in the Deputy Leader of Opposition speech in the Tallinn Euros final, or I guess I should say the most recent Tallinn Euros final, where the Deputy Leader of Opposition there tries to extend the debate into the international dimension and saying, okay, so here's a new avenue of the debate coming from DLO. Didn't necessarily work out successfully for them, but nonetheless, like always a good approach and a legitimate thing to do coming from the deputy speech. So two notes on that. One, some people advise prepping separately for this reason, to make sure there are fresh ideas, make sure there are fresh perspectives, not necessarily for the entirety of prep time, but at least for, say, 5 minutes out of the 15. I don't care for it personally. I like to be able to have a continual dialogue with my partner. Obviously, there needs to be time in order to actually write speeches and so on. You should probably have some system in place where you can say, look, shut up now, I've got to write. But being that as it may, maybe less written, I don't know. Depends on the dynamic. But be that as it may, I mention it because some people think this is an important part of the process in order to make sure that you are able to do that thinking about the debate from different avenues. So if you think there's a risk that if you prep together, especially from the outset, that will mean that you tend to focus on a very narrow range of issues in the debate, and therefore you find there's a degree of consistency with which you're losing to closing teams. That would definitely be one thing to think about as a way to change up the way you've been approaching these kind of prep issues in the past, to try and make sure that you are getting those kind of avenues for extension on the table because you're thinking about the debate from different ways. Secondly, run all the material you can think of in the diamonds of the deputy speech. So obviously if you've got proper substantive extension material that you think is important and you think it's important to get developed, give that the time it deserves in order to kind of flesh it out properly, right? That should be a core part of your deputy speech. However, if there are additional avenues that you just don't have time for because you're already discussing things that you think are more important issues to get analysed properly, but you've thought it up, or alternatively you just think they're actually of fairly low importance compared to other things you need to be doing, like responding to the team opposite, or alternatively rebuilding your partner's material, well, that's fine, but you should still mention them somewhere. And certainly I found when debating against Ben Adams, or before I started speaking with John, debating against John, one of the things they did quite well was in the dying minutes of the deputy speech would just burn through a bunch of extension material. This has more of a psychological effect on the closing teams than it does actually in terms of helping you win the debate with that material, I think. By virtue of the fact that most judges probably don't credit half-analysed material that comes out in minutes 6.5, or don't credit it more than they should, let's put it that way. And in practice, therefore, the benefit is it might actually just discourage teams from running that material if they feel it's been run before. Or alternatively, when they do run that material, it might seem to judges as this is less new than would otherwise, because, well, opening already kind of discussed that and implied that it wasn't necessarily all that important, but they'd clearly already thought of that, so maybe that means that the closing team, at the very least, has the bar lifted considerably in terms of raised considerably in terms of how much analysis they would need to be adding to what's already been mentioned by the opening team in those cases. So that can be a good way to try and make life slightly harder for your closing team, even if you don't feel you have proper time in order to develop those ideas properly. So if you had to trade off between, the classic, what 3 things have I told you in this speech, Mr. Speaker, and spending those 30 seconds just burn through as much extension material as possible, maybe burn through the extension material, because it might well be that it freaks out the team coming behind you. So your goal here is to try and close off avenues of major newness. It's always worth remembering that you can inform yourself about what you should be doing as a speaker by applying the rules that you would apply as a judge backwards, as it were. If that doesn't make sense, here's the example. So the rule for whether or not something is a winning extension is not, is it new? The rule for whether or not something is a winning extension is whether or not the addition that it makes to the debate in terms of the overall context of the debate is sufficiently important that it's more important than stuff coming from the opening team. Now, that obviously can be contextual relative to how those other teams are placing, right? So if the material coming from closing government is enough, even if it's quite marginal, to place them ahead of an opening opposition team that has clearly beaten their opening government, well, that's enough of an extension to win on. But by and large, it means that you don't necessarily need to worry that much about making sure you left no avenues for things that are new, but you're looking at for 2 possible grounds, or you're looking at for possible grounds that the closing teams can use to try and justify them placing ahead of you, especially given they've got 2 speeches to do it. They've got 1 speech in order to put that material on the table, and they've got a whole other speech in order to try and explain to the judges why those new additions justify them being placed ahead of you. So the 2 broad avenues on which this would be substantive reasons why things that you have said are true, so kind of looking for those underlying reasons why the things that you've said in your case are fundamentally true, and trying to justify that on a more kind of fundamental level than you had. This is one of those reasons why providing that underlying analysis, which I think is the 3rd thing we're discussing in this 1, 2, 3 setup, can be very important. And the other is just looking for new avenues of the debate. So, I mean, 4 examples of what that kind of might mean. You maybe have discussed what your policy would look like in the developed world. Have you thought about how your policy would look in the developing world? Often it can be that closing teams say, well, our new thing is we're going to talk about this in the developing world context. We don't necessarily have the same kind of institutions. Don't let them do that. If you think that's potentially a valuable way of extending the debate, make sure you do it in the deputy speech. Second, what kind of signal it sends out, how it changes the incentives of different actors to act in particular ways. If you've been primarily discussing the short-term effects of the policy, make sure you also have some discussion of the long-term effects of the policy as well, and how those long-term effects are likely to be beneficial if your proposition or harmful if your opposition. These would often be ways in which a closing team would try and justify their contribution as being important. So you can literally just run through that list backwards in order to in order to think of the things that you should be trying to do in the deputy speech. Now, Bear in mind this list obviously is not exhaustive. This is literally just 3 things you could think about, and you hopefully have, whether or not written down or just internalized to some extent, the similar kind of checklist which you would apply when you're trying to pick out extensions or pick out frameworks to try and summarize the case if you're a sum speaker from bottom half. Apply those to the deputy speech and see if you can use those to try and plug avenues that your closing team might be able to push themselves through. So the second function of deputy speeches we're going to discuss is providing reasons for judges to knock out the team opposite. Now, that might be a strange way of phrasing it, but bear in mind that you're not necessarily just being their arguments, you're also trying to explain to judges why you should be placed relatively ahead of that team. And that can be particularly important if you're thinking about opening government relative to opening opposition. It's easier to explain this in terms of what the DLO should be doing, slightly harder in terms of the Deputy Prime Minister. And I think this is one of those cases where we're going to have to treat those two positions slightly differently. So with regards to both to some extent, the first approach in terms of knocking out the other team, I think we're only really to discuss 2, aren't we? Yeah, we're only really, oh, maybe there's a third somewhere there. Okay. Rebuttal, rebuttal, rebuttal. So an approach to the deputy speech that just says, look, we're going to take out the other team by a more or less line-by-line approach to demolish everything I've said. Quite common with American teams, especially because that's what they've been used to coming from APTA, if they're APTA BP teams, and also seems to be weirdly popular with some of the high-level Australian teams, particularly if you run the clock back a few years and are watching debates circa, say, 2011 with Monash A or Sydney A. A lot of the time they set up a strong case in the first speech, and then the second speech primarily functions to do just line-by-line rebuttal if they're opposite numbers. So this works better or worse depending on where your threats are. As we said earlier, if closing is a major threat, you probably want to be more concerned about trying to do what we were talking about earlier and break off those possible lines of extension. If the PM's case is enough to win the debate and the Deputy Prime Minister knocks out opening opposition by exhaustion, it's highly unlikely that opening government will not win the debate, however. So if that's maybe not entirely obvious, think about it this way. If the Prime Minister sets up a strong case, and if the Deputy Prime Minister is able to rebut opening opposition out of the debate, so kind of extinguish their case before it ever gets to closing government, it's actually quite difficult for the judge to justify placing closing government ahead of an opening government team has effectively done all they need to do to win, right? They've justified, assume we're talking about a policy debate because it's simpler, they've done all they could possibly be required to do to justify implementing the policy. They've dealt with all the objections for the team that they were able to engage with, and then CG show up, and they maybe have some interesting things to say. But in order to be able to win that debate, especially given they can't really directly engage with OO, there's not going to be a back and forth process between them, they need to hit that reset button really, really hard and try to justify to the judges why the new material they're bringing into the debate is so fundamentally important that this really has become a bottom half debate. You know, the debate really didn't start until closing government showed up. And that can be very difficult. And I think Botswana Worlds, the Botswana Worlds final is a great example of that dynamic playing out, where you get an opening government team that devotes their Deputy Prime Minister's speech primarily to demolishing the team opposite. And it means that a closing government team, even though they do a very good job, doesn't really have enough of an angle to be able to sufficiently justify them being placed ahead of an opening government team that's done all they could have possibly been required to do in order to win the debate. So yeah, I think generally speaking there's a tendency for judges to intuitively favour opening government teams who have knocked out their opening opposition number for that reason. It becomes just harder for them to justify placing other teams ahead of it. In terms of how your approach to rebuttal should be, insofar as possible, you should try and turn your rebuttal into substantive material. So I mean, one reason for this is just to say that, especially if you're dealing with, say, mid-level judges, it can be much easier for them to follow a case which is, say, 2 or 3 points of rebuttal and 4 points of substantive than, say, 7 or 8 points of rebuttal and 2 points of substantive. So how would you go about turning rebuttal into substantive? Well, if an argument made by the other side is important and sufficiently important that it's going to become an issue in the debate going forward. One, you should probably want to make it a substantive argument because it becomes harder for a closing team to say, oh, well, they just discussed this in rebuttal, but we're really giving this substantive argument. But second, the approach you probably should be taking is saying, okay, they have made this claim. If we provide substantive analysis that tends towards the contradiction of that claim, so tends towards the opposite conclusion than the team opposite are claiming, then one, well, we clearly clash with that claim, but second, it means that we provided additional substantive analysis to support our case. So you see this a lot of the time in cases where, for example, opposition would challenge the opening government team in terms of whether or not the policy they're implementing is a legitimate thing for the government to be doing, right? The Deputy Prime Minister clearly should then devote some time to trying to justify the state legitimacy claim, not just by saying, well, they said it was illegitimate, but we didn't think they analysed that well enough, or they said it was illegitimate, but they're wrong because reason. Instead say, and my second point is why this is a sensible extension of the kind of actions that we see the state engaging in all the time in modern Western liberal democracies, and provide examples of where the state would engage in similar policies and provide some degree of explanation as to why this should be a positive duty of the state. So not just is this legitimate, but why the state should, I guess that kind of is the same idea, but not just why this is legitimate, but why this is a positive duty on the part of the state, insofar as those are different things. And again, I think maybe just as a prophylactic measure against very low-level judges, often quite useful to highlight when it is responding to arguments from the other side, that it is responding to arguments from the other side. But you can do this when you're introducing the point. So, my second point, and this deals with their claim about the role of the state, just as a means of making sure that people that maybe aren't following when one argument clashes with another, that it does. Substantive responsive material challenges the premises of the opposition team's case by providing analysis to a contradictory conclusion. That could be a way of thinking about it. When can you turn what would otherwise be a point of rebuttal into a point of substantive on your side? It's generally beneficial to do that when you can. So all rebuttal will be integrated. That's what we really mean, providing substantive analysis on your side when might otherwise just be a kind of throwaway line of rebuttal. Try and turn it into substantive argument. So one thing to remember is that blunders made by the opening team don't necessarily only need to harm that opening team. So that applies to you if you're a deputy speaker, but it also applies to the team opposite as well. And this is something to bear in mind when you are engaging with that other team by rebuttal. So what I mean by this, and this is, it's usual that people remember this with regards to model, especially when engaging with an opening government team. It is less common that people remember this when they're engaging with an opening opposition team. So you could just engage with the opening opposition team by saying, well, they've taken this silly stance, and this stance is silly. Here's why. But ideally, you want that to be a bag that you can also hang around the neck of the team in closing opposition as well, because your options in terms of direct engagement with closing opposition are going to be quite limited. So ideally, you want to make it very clear to the judges the stance that the opening opposition team have taken from the deputy speaker, if you're deputy prime minister, make it very clear what stance the LO has taken in the debate, whether they're counterpropping or whether they've just adopted a stance in terms of saying we're defending the status quo for these reasons, especially if what they've done is very silly, and demands that closing opposition defend that stance, right? Now, obviously closing opposition probably won't want to, will probably try and depart from it, but it makes it that little bit harder for them to do so if you've taken something that is implicit in opening opposition and made it explicit. The worry is that closing opposition teams are often given a lot of additional wiggle room. Whether or not they should is something that's often discussed. Are they in the coalition model? The important thing is, in terms of signaling to the judges, you want to minimize the extent to which they have this additional degree of flexibility to depart from their opening team, just by making what stance that opening opposition team have made explicit, explaining from the deputy speech what the clash between the two sides is. So at some point in your deputy speech, there should be the following line or something to the effect that says, look, leader of opposition told you this was a debate about this and so this means the fundamental clash is about this versus this, right? Once that has happened, it's quite difficult for a closing opposition team to justify departing from that stance without it feeling like they're knifing something, without it feeling like they're being very unfair to the opening government team in top half, because the debate had already been set up to be about something else, and they're changing the fundamental of the debate, the fundamentals of what the debate is about, rather than engaging with that debate. So make a big deal of the blunder, not just as a reason to beat that opening opposition team, but as a reason to try and beat the closing opposition team as well, and say, well, that's now a stance that opening opposition has taken. Be wary of opening opposition reloading rebuttal. So by this I mean putting a lot of their engagement with your opening government case into their deputy leader of opposition speech, and having very little in the leader of opposition speech itself. We'll be discussing issues of reloading in general in a moment, but in terms of what you should be doing as the Deputy Prime Minister, if they do seem to be trying to pull this move, which is, say, if their engagement with your Prime Minister's case from LO seems to be fairly minimal, obviously engage with what they say, but point out to the judges that this is the fact. Claim that by doing so they have conceded some of these arguments. Say that that means they've clearly conceded that the definition of the debate is reasonable. They've clearly consented to the idea that the model is going to do the job that it's supposed to do. Now, the judges may buy this, they may not buy this, but it does at least highlight what is going on, that there is a degree of illegitimacy of their engagement with you coming only from the second speech. There was an interesting question about this in the Tallinn judge test, but we don't actually know what the agreed upon answer to the question of whether or not it's reasonable for an opening opposition team to do that. From your point of view, though, it's very inconvenient if the team does get away with it. So again, the point here is to try and make it as clear to the judges as possible that they are doing this, that what they are doing has costs, and that you want them to try and bear those costs. That by them doing this, it means that they've conceded some of those arguments, or they've given ground when it's inconvenient for them to do so. They easily could have engaged with it, they chose not to, so that means a lot of our arguments coming for the Prime Minister's speech stand because they haven't been engaged with. Second, pay close attention to what material is being engaged with, and try to turn that into a framing narrative in order to justify to judges why they should drop the opening opposition team. So a very, very good example of that comes in the 2016 quarterfinal between Harvard, Princeton, Brown, and Harthouse, where this is the debate about whether or not African Americans should be given their own state and supported by the US government. A difficult debate for a proposition to win on practical grounds, one might think. Probably easier for them to win on principle grounds. And therefore, the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, which I definitely recommend watching as an example of one approach to deputy speeches done very, very well, engage with the opening opposition by castigating them for failing to engage with the principled claims that were made in the Prime Minister's speech, declaring that by doing so they've effectively lost the debate, and demanding some engagement with those principled arguments. Now, the closing opposition team eventually engage with those principled arguments by means of rolling the practical case into a principled case, and arguably therefore go on to win the debate. But the opening opposition team doesn't necessarily re-engage with that challenge, and even if they do, re-engaging with that challenge from the DLO, having failed to engage with the principled side of the debate from LO, is made to feel as if it's illegitimate by the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, by the extent of the emphasis he places on the extent to which their failure to engage with the principal case means they've lost the debate. So this is one of those things where a judge's intuitions about what a team needs to do, what the burdens of the debate are malleable, and they can be changed by what the deputy speaker says about the case. Again, one of those cases I would say where front-loading a material is actually quite useful. So if there's a variety of different arguments made by the Prime Minister and you're the Deputy Prime Minister, it means when you listen to what is being engaged with by the Leader of Opposition, you can then choose to emphasize those elements that weren't engaged with and say, well, these were really the most important aspects of the case, and their failure to engage with that means they've effectively lost this debate before the Deputy Leader even gets up to speak. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean you don't engage with the parts they do engage with, but just make it clear to the judges that by failure to engage with the things they didn't engage with, they've effectively lost the debate. The more material that you have in the first speech, the harder it is for a leader of opposition, because they're stressed and they haven't heard what you're going to say, to be able to engage with all of it. So it's more likely you'll be able to tell one of these kinds of stories from the deputy speech. At least this is one of the theories behind front-loading material. So third, in the deputy leader of opposition speech, so just to switch to the other side of the table for a moment, you're kind of looking for ways to try and summarize the bottom half, the top half in such a way that you can explain to judges why it is that the leader of opposition and the new material coming from the deputy leader of opposition addresses the main concerns coming from the government, and second, and this is quite important, what it is that the closing government team have to engage with in order to stay in the game. So this gives closing government effectively two options. If you tell them what they need to do in order to engage with the debate, and they decide to ignore it, it gives you a good story to tell to the judges by means of POI, of just saying, well, look, we told you you had to engage with this, you failed to do so, therefore you've lost the debate. Alternatively, if they do engage with it, they might win that engagement, they might not. But by engaging with the challenges you set out, of saying, here is where we've beaten opening government, and therefore this is what CG need to do in order to stay relevant in this debate, or try and salvage the proposition case. By setting it up that way, if they do choose to engage with it, they're kind of endorsing your narrative of what has happened in the top half of the debate, which is not necessarily to their disadvantage, right? They have just as much of a reason to want to beat the opening government team as you do, so it seems reasonable for them to maybe concede implicitly or even explicitly that narrative of what happened in the top half was reasonable. But second, ideally you want them to feel obliged to continue to engage with your material into the debate. You're probably doing pretty well if the government whip is spending a lot of time talking about your case, and particularly your narrative of what the debate is about in terms of its comparatives. I think you can see a very good example, and this is what I mentioned earlier in terms of the summative model of how to approach deputy leader of opposition speeches. You can see a very good example of that in the DLO speech from the Manila Worlds, which is so Worlds 2012, octo final between Oxford A, BPPA, Cambridge A, and UCLA. So this is, UCLA, ULU A. So this is the Andrew Tuffin speech in DLO. Very good example of a sum, effectively, of the top half, which sets the agenda for the rest of the debate going forward, and said, well, this is what a closing government team would need to do in order to stick in. It does that more implicitly and explicitly, but there's a very clear summation of the issues coming out of the top half and why it is that the LO material is winning on all those fronts. The third area of responsibility that we're saying that deputy speeches have is deepening the analysis from the opening speaker. So first, preliminarily, we probably want to say what deepening actually means. So I don't feel that deepening means just repeating the material with embellishments. And in fact, in bird culture, this can be known as a dick move, because it does aid you in terms of speaks, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the team in terms of, winning over those points. What we probably mean is providing fundamental reasons why something is true. So, I mean, an obvious generic example of this would be when you provide, say, structural reasons why a fact claim made in the first speech, and which some of the claims made in the first speech rest upon, why structural reasons why those things would be true in society. So the way in which incentives, for example, line up in such a way that those claims are true. That would be something that moves the debate onto its fundamentals, or trying to provide some kind of principled analysis of, God, I hate to say role of the state again, but some principled analysis as to why the state should do certain things that the first speaker's case implicitly suggests that it should be doing. So you're trying to provide underlying analysis for some of those claims before the closing team is able to do that for you. I think an interesting example of this would be the semi from 2016 Worlds, where you see the deputy speaker of opening government trying to do this, and I think, I don't know if there's a consensus on this, but I think probably there's a good argument for saying the opening government team actually end up winning the debate. But the deputy speaker trying to do this, and then the closing government team coming along behind and saying, well, here is our deeper analysis on this front, and trying to provide a next level of analysis further on, of saying, well, here is why in terms of the fundamentals of how colonialism worked, why certain of the claims by an opening government are true. So I think you see this a lot in the dynamic that, so closing government was Harvard A. In that Harvard A team's approach to debates, I don't know how many of their debates are available online, but for those that can find them, you see there's a lot in terms of the narrative that they're able to construct between them of, say, Bo trying to provide more fundamental analysis and then Finelli explaining, well, you know, nothing in this debate made sense until Bo stood up and he told you, blah, blah, blah. If nowhere else, you can see a good example of that in the 2016 semi-final. But this is the kind of thing that maybe you should be trying to do yourself from the deputy speech. You might not be able to close off all possible lines of fundamental analysis, but it's something whereby you want to do the best job you can to try and close off those options. Figure out what it is. So, I mean, if you've followed the front-loading strategy, there's a lot of material in the first speech which hasn't necessarily been analysed to its absolute fullest. And this is a sacrifice that the first speaker is making for your benefit, right? You are a team, and that is something which arguably to some extent costs them. It might cost them what speaks, but it's something that they are doing for your strategic benefit. So you can then pick amongst that material and decide what it is you want to pivot to, where it is that you want to provide more fundamental analysis, where it is you think that their material needs to be shored up in terms of how well analysed it was in the first speech, where it needs to be analysed better. And to some extent you can rely on signals from the team opposite to tell you where those things are, because obviously they're engaged in trying to looking for weak spots, and so they will probably help tell you where those weak spots are. But the more you can do to try and look at those weak spots yourself, probably the better you're doing. I think again the analysis, the example of the Deputy Prime Minister's speech in the FES quarterfinal is a good example here, where the pivot to that principal material is very much done on the basis of saying, well, look, okay, our practical case is probably not the material that we need to be the most important material in this debate if we're going to win. It needs to be the principal stuff, and that's the stuff that's had the least engagement from the Leader of Opposition speech, therefore should devote a certain amount of time in the deputy speech to try and make that principal analysis seem as important as humanly possible, to try and increase the significance of that material in the debate as a whole. Because the more significant that material becomes, one, the better a chance of winning, but second, the more it seems like a mistake that the opening opposition team didn't engage with that material. The second thing I think a deputy speech really should be doing in terms of extending the material that's come from the first speech is providing metrics. So it's not always possible to do this in the first speech. Certainly I think Leader of Opposition speeches should probably have some, at least, explanation of what they think the comparative in the debate is, because they've heard both sides of the debate by that point. So it's probably to their advantage, and certainly for the advantage of the judges in terms of the overall clarity of the debate, for Leader of Opposition speech to do that. But the Prime Minister is often not in the position to be able to do that, because they haven't heard what LO are going to do. As we've said, it can be useful, just in order to be able to make sure that a closing team can't depart from a case made by an opening team, that you really want to be clear from the deputy speech, the Deputy Prime Minister's speech, what the comparative between the two sides is, especially if you think that comparative set up by OO is probably a mistake in terms of opposition. But increasingly, metrics are becoming something that judges look for. There's a number of judge briefings and so on that say, well, teams really need to be providing their own metrics as to say what things are important and what things aren't important. Judges can't be expected to rely on their own intuitions about this, and therefore, until some kind of metric about why something is important is given, arguments can't really be credited relative to one to the other. I'm not really here to say whether I think that's a good change or a bad change, but the change nonetheless is occurring, and it's sensible to be responsive to that. And given that's the case, it means that a lot more credit is being given to metric extensions coming from closing teams, where they say, well, we're the team that is providing the explanation as to why, for example, principled arguments are more important than practical arguments in this debate, or why it is that the harm to people who want to send their kids to private school is more important than the benefit to people that want an equal playing field for abolishing private schools or whatever, or not abolishing private schools. Whichever example we choose, given that a closing team is now more likely to be credited for a metric extension, make sure you have those metrics in your deputy speech, right? The Prime Minister probably doesn't have time, doesn't have the opportunity to do it in a way that relativizes those metrics to what you've heard from the opposition team. So probably something should be a key part of your extension. And remembering that it's not so much just an offensive tool against your opposition teams, but it is also a defensive tool against your closing teams, again, insofar as an explanation as to why your material is the most important material in the debate is something that it can also be used as much as trying to grab extensions from opening to try and limit the extent to which a closing team can try and push you out of the debate or try to justify why their material is more important. You at least have some of that material preemptively on the table to try and limit the extent to which they can do that. So the sooner you get those explanations out, probably the better. So it might be the kind of thing you want to have in the first speech as well. But given space, especially if you're front loading, in the first speech is limited, certainly something that's very sensible for a deputy speech to be trying to do, of saying, look, we told you this, and this is why this is the most important material in the debate. Two ways in which you'd probably do that. So you would try and justify it given the motion's wording of saying, well, look, we think that given the way the wording is motion, the motion is worded, we think probably the most important thing for any proposition team to tell you is why thus and thus and so forth, why it is that this is, say, the highest or the most difficult set of cases for a proposition team, or indeed an opposition team, to be dealing with. These kind of things would be a good way to explain the comparative importance of the case that you've chosen to make. Similarly, you can do it by reference to the case coming from the opposition side. So now you've heard what it is the opposition stance is, that tells you something about the comparative between the two teams, and that can be used as a means of trying to create a story to tell judges as to why the case that you've chosen is the most important material in the debate. The third section here is laying traps. So this is making use of the dynamic between the first speech and the deputy speech in order to try and, I guess, benefit you in various ways. So we'll look at some traps, some of which are legitimate and some of which are illegitimate. So the first is reloaded analysis. So there's something really against the rules, and indeed it's almost inevitable in some cases, that the stronger analysis will come from the second speaker. And I think you can see examples of this, for example, with the Cambridge A team from Zagreb Euros in round 7, and in a lesser extent, I guess, the final, where there's a lot of claims asserted in the Prime Minister's speech that don't really receive fundamental analysis until the deputy speech. They don't really have much analytical justification until the deputy speech. So, I mean, the reason that this can sometimes be important is a lot of the time, especially, say, if we're dealing with opening opposition teams can forget that they're engaging with the team as a whole's version of an argument, rather than just, say, the Prime Minister's version of the argument. And the reason for this is relatively straightforward. If you think about the situation psychologically, they've had much longer to think about the version of the argument they had coming from the Prime Minister, so it's much more likely they're going to have that in their mind when they're writing the speech, or when they had written the speech. We'll discuss the practical issues of when you're ideally supposed to be writing deputy speeches in a moment. But it does mean that reloaded analysis has a tendency to maybe slip by teams if they're not as responsive as they should be to the speech immediately before them. So as a measure of trying to protect against this, obviously try and be more flexible in terms of listening to the speaker immediately before you to see if there's important changes in the way that they're analysing an argument. I never recommend this as a tactic particularly, but it's something that does happen with a lot of teams that's worth thinking about. And indeed, I think it's something that's almost inevitable if teams do practice a heavy degree of front-loading. It's obvious that a lot of those arguments will require additional explanation in order to analyse them properly coming to the deputy speech, and therefore it might be possible that they end up placing ahead of an opening opposition team just because the opening opposition team doesn't pivot to deal with the strong analysis. The second example is rear-loaded material in OO. So this is slightly more controversial, and perhaps rightly so. You can hear a very good explanation of why this is controversial circa 2010 ways of thinking about judging, or I guess arguably earlier, if you watch Jan Okar's workshop for the Red Sea Open on doing opening opposition, I think it's still on YouTube. So the issue is when you have analysis which extends the debate in whole new directions, coming from the Deputy Leader of Opposition speech. Is that fair? Is that unfair in terms of the engagement with opening government? Again, this was on the Tallinn Euros judge test, but we never heard what the Tallinn team actually thought about the issue, so I guess we'll wait for bated breath to find out what Mexico World thinks about this issue, if they have strong feelings about it. But the issue from a practical point of view can, I think, be exemplified if we look at one of those examples from earlier when we were discussing the Court Worlds final. Now, as I said, arguably the strongest material on the opposition bench in that debate came out in the Deputy Leader of Opposition speech to discuss the practical consequences of implementing the ban on abortion. Now, if we were to imagine the closing government team, I think it didn't become an issue there because they'd already done enough to knock out the opening government team before it got to there. But if we imagine that, say, the closing government team and the opening government team swapped positions, we would then start to see why there might be a problem. That if the closing government team has very good engagement with the principled arguments coming out of LO, they've to some extent done their job as best they can, and then they end up being beaten by this practical issue coming out from the DLO. One of the answers that the Tallinn judge test did say, well, you know, sucks to be them, but this is what can happen to you if you get a closing opposition team trying to extend the debate in new avenues. But it's something to be aware of, and it's worth thinking about the fact that sometimes judges can be a little bit hostile to this if they think it's egregiously unfair that you're extending the debate in a completely new way, that sometimes they might deprioritize those arguments if they're coming to the DLO speech. Again, if you're following the rule that says you're trying to front load your most important material, it doesn't really become that much of an issue, and rather it just becomes a question of where you put the emphasis of the analysis on between the first and the second speech. But it can be something you can use as an offensive tool against you, against other teams. If you feel so inclined that you can leave some of the really important arguments to the deputy speech to then effectively knock out an opening government team that hasn't necessarily foreseen those arguments and hasn't had a chance to engage with them. Again, I think to some extent you can see an attempt to do this in the Tallinn Euros final. I think the argument there would be, well, look, it was certainly possible for an opening government team to foresee that material and the international dimensions of this policy would be important, and therefore it's not illegitimate for a deputy leader of opposition to try and extend the debate onto that arena any more than it would be for a closing opposition team to do so. So, I mean, that is, I guess the question is the fine line between when judges might be slightly alienated by this because they feel you're pulling a fast one, and in cases where judges would shrug their shoulders and say, well, you know, sucks to be opening government if they didn't foresee that this was an important issue to have in the debate. Much harder to get away with it if it's, say, reloaded rebuttal that challenges things to do with, say, the mechanism or things to do with the definition. Most judges will not let deputy leaders of opposition away with making those kind of challenges if they've not come out in the leader of opposition speech. The last kind of trap I think is quite interesting, which is to some extent a case where the punchline is delayed of a strategic move that's made in the leader speech. And this is probably best exemplified by an example. So it's not actually a BP debate, but if you go on YouTube and you have a look at the 2011 Australs debate on banning sexist indigenous cultural practices, you see a very interesting dynamic formed from the leader of opposition speech onwards. So Prime Minister's speech, great, sets up the debate in a sensible enough manner. Leader of opposition says, well, look, we're going to have our own metric for when it's acceptable, when it isn't acceptable, and that metric is consent, the extent to which people have opted into these practices, and whether they're kind of willing participants as adults. And something very strange happens then, which is the Deputy Prime Minister doesn't necessarily pivot as much in response to this, and said, well, look, you know, what I assume they were trying to build up to, because it doesn't get mentioned in the Prime Minister's speech, but it forms a lot of the Deputy speech, and says, well, their burden is they need to defend female genital mutilation. They really need to defend this case. Because obviously no one really wants to be in the position of defending that, I suspect. And so presumably it was supposed to be, aha, you know, here's a hard case you need to defend, justify that, coming from the second speech. But obviously they do have a defence against that and similar hard cases because of the stance they've taken, and this is pointed out by the Deputy Leader of Opposition. So this is the extent to which the punchline of the setup of the debate doesn't come out until the Deputy Leader of Opposition, where they say, well, look, sure, we would have to defend female genital mutilation in the case of an adult female choosing freely, without any pressure, to engage in female circumcision. We think those cases are incredibly rare, but in the case that one or two of them did happen, we defend that. We think that's their right to opt into that kind of practice, just as it's the right of men to engage in, you know, adult male circumcision if they like. So that means that you can have cases where you can lay the groundwork for important arguments coming from the first speech and then snap the trap shut in the second. Difficult sometimes to pull off, especially given you know, you need the stars to be in alignment in terms of what motion it is and what argument you're wanting to make and what argument to come up to. So the opportunities to do this are scarce, but can be a very effective move insofar as it's very difficult to protect against it. If you were, say, the opening government team in that scenario, you would have to foresee where it is that definition was going in order to be able to protect against it, and that can be quite difficult in a high-stress environment, as debating often is. So the next two sections, I notice we're actually up to an hour, but be that as it may, so the next two sections are going to be 3 classic mistakes made in deputy speeches, to some extent alluded to already, and then practical matters. So really talking about writing deputy speeches and how you go about doing that, or how, in my opinion, in my experience, here are good ways to go about doing that. So 3 classic mistakes. So 1, the speech is all rebuttaled and structured as such. So we've already discussed how to deal with this. Turn rebuttal into substantive, right? Obviously it's fine if in practice most of the speech is responsive to the LO speech. In some ways, especially if the Deputy Prime Minister's material is good and is standing and it's already sufficiently well analysed, that might be the optimal thing to do, especially if your main threat in that debate is the opening opposition team as opposed to the closing government team. But be that as it may, it probably shouldn't be structured in that way. It's going to be harder for the judges to follow maybe than it would be otherwise if it was trying to repackage as substantive, and it might make it feel like material which is then covered again by closing government as substantive is newer than it in fact is, because judges sometimes find it difficult to get their heads around the rule that says that rebuttal is substantive for, to some extent, 2 sides of the same coin. The second problem, which is actually the reason that I ended up giving up doing deputy speeches for Vienna, is that the speech is a do-over of the first speech, maybe at a faster pace because it now has more material to cover because it's simultaneously redoing the first speech and it's responding to the speakers opposite. So, 2 seconds. Cool. Sorry for that interruption. So, when the speech is a do-over of the first speech, but probably at a faster pace, this is quite a hard habit to break. I was unable to break it. It's also something that you can see very good teams sometimes falling prey to. So, having praised the Michael Ashish combination when Michael is speaking as deputy, I think I should probably note that one of the oddities in terms of when Michael and Harish were speaking together in opening half was there was always a feeling that Harish was just going over the same arguments with a slightly different spin in the second speech. And this is maybe something you can also see of the most recent Oxford A team of Rafi and Tommy. The reason this is probably something that is less than ideal is because obviously, as we've discussed, it removes some of the strategic flexibility you want the deputy to have in terms of being able to cover new material, and certainly cover new material differently. We found that when I was speaking deputy, we dropped in at least one semi-final because the panel felt that I was challenging the mechanism from the deputy speech. I didn't feel that I was, but they felt that I was. And I think this can be a problem if you can't really get out of the mindset of being a leader of opposition when you're speaking in deputy. So even if intuitively you think there are strong reasons why it might be beneficial for you to be deputy, you maybe should road test it. But also, I mean, so far as there are ways to try and get around this, I think the first would be to try and break yourself of the habit of trying to cover the same material again that your partner has already covered. So to some extent, bar yourself, in the same way that you might say bar yourself from repeating material that your opening team has covered if you're speaking in closing, bar yourself from mentioning arguments that your partner has made. The difficulty of that is the trade-off between wanting to properly rebuild arguments that maybe weren't made as well as they could have been versus following that last piece of advice. And I think that can be a difficult line to try and draw, and we'll discuss the practical ways to try and go about deciding what to rebuild and what not to rebuild when we're discussing the practical aspects of doing deputy speeches. The third classic mistake is the speech forgets that there are other teams in the debate. This is especially a problem with deputy of opposition speeches. So this is the classic mistake of saying, well, opening government have messed up and we're clearly better than opening government, therefore we should win. Obviously, this is not a narrative that the closing teams are going to particularly accept, and in some ways it's, as we've discussed, a wasted opportunity, right? If you are opening government and your opening opposition team mess up, that should be to your advantage. You can then tie opening opposition to closing opposition and try and sync them both with the same mistake, and obviously that can happen in terms of opening government and closing government. The important thing is, if your opening government team has messed up and you're opening opposition, you should actually probably not spend too much time bashing them for it. The reason being, presumably if it's incredibly obvious to you, it's also very obvious to your judges. So the benefit of you laying it on for 7 minutes, or I guess 14 minutes, is actually quite limited compared to the benefit in terms of trying to build substantive argumentation for the opposition side in order to try and justify, say, the contradiction of the motion, the opposite of the motion. That would be much more beneficial in terms of your trying to beat your closing teams as opposed to an opening government team that, according to you anyway, is dead in the water anyway. So you probably don't want to spend all that much time on them. You probably want to concentrate on the fact that there are other teams in the debate than the team that's immediately in front of them. And so the worse they become, probably the less time you really need to spend talking about them compared to trying to extend the debate into other avenues that otherwise a closing team might do, or the closing government team might also extend the debate into. Practical matters. So I think the first issue is that you should have a good understanding of what the first speaker is supposed to be saying. So at bare minimum, you should have the headline points that are going to form part of their case. And then you should check that they actually say it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. You'll find a similar phenomenon if you're a some speaker monitoring extension speech, that sometimes people say the things that they were supposed to be saying in the extension and sometimes they don't. The thing is, what they have said is what the judges have heard. This is a particularly important thing if you're a deputy speaker, because knowing what they have said, knowing maybe what they have underanalyzed or underemphasized and what they haven't, so what they were supposed to be covering but they haven't necessarily covered, is very important for you, because it tells you what you need to cover in the deputy speech. It tells you what you need to emphasize in the deputy speech. It tells you what you need to analyze. You should do this with your judge hat on, right? You should never be critical of your partner within the round, and you should probably maybe be light on being critical of them after the rounds too. But in terms of how it is you approach their material, you should be quite critical. You should be saying to yourself, okay, here's what they did badly, here's what I need to make sure I fix, here's the kind of hole in their analysis that I need to plug. And the more you can try and get yourself into a neutral mindset for doing that, the better you'll be able to do that process. The better you'll be able to recognize where their case was at its weakest and what gaps you need to plug. Second, unless you are sure that you want to split material, in which case you presumably have a certain amount written down that were the split arguments, so the arguments that have been allocated to the deputy speech during prep time. You should probably be starting to write your speech during the Prime Minister's speech. I realise that sounds daunting, but you really don't know what it is that you want to cover in your deputy speech before the Prime Minister has already started speaking. And that's because the first thing that you'll be probably wanting to cover is places where maybe they should have analysed things differently. You want to be able to cover those arguments. Maybe dress them up with a slightly different headline point so it doesn't seem like you're just repeating material, but you want to make sure you're going over those things, but you don't know which those things are. Hopefully you're not going into the debate knowing where it is your partner is likely to be making mistakes. If you do, you should probably tell them, make sure you analyze this one properly. This bit's important. When you're doing this, you should also, though, leave plenty of room for new material, but also new arguments. The reason for this is the most important source, again, we're imagining you the Deputy Prime Minister because this is harder than if you're the Deputy Leader of Opposition. The most important source for your material is going to be the LO speech, right? That is where most of the stuff that you need to be engaging with comes from. That's where most of the information about what the comparative is you want to set up in the debate, and that's where most of the information about which is likely to inform the kind of decisions you want to make about what to emphasize for the Prime Minister's speech, what to extend upon before closing government can get an opportunity to, because of the debate dynamic that's been set up by LO, is going to be coming from the LO speech. So that kind of means the bulk of your writing is going to happen during that speech. Now, it can't all happen during that speech, because unless you're incredibly good at dealing with very minimalistic notes, it's probably not going to be the case that you can take comprehensive notes to be able to deliver a 7-minute speech while listening competently to another 7-minute speech, right? This is just a psychological barrier that most people have that can't do dichotic listening tasks, I don't know. So the important thing to note, though, is that a certain amount of the writing does have to happen during the LO speech, just in order to be dynamically responsive to that speech. And you have to be realistic about that. You have to give yourself, one, the amount of time in order to do that. Second, the like room on the paper to be able to do that. But if you're DLO, it makes life slightly easier. But remember to actually take your own notes of the Prime Minister's speech, independent of your partner's engagement with them. For the simple reason, the way a lot of people mess up, we've already discussed the extent to which Deputy Leader of Oppositions can sometimes make the mistake of only focusing on the Prime Minister's version of an argument rather than the Deputy Prime Minister's argument, but the reverse is also true, right? There might be good arguments that come out from the Prime Minister's speech that aren't properly engaged with by the LO and really need to be engaged with by the DLO. In order to be able to be in the position to make that kind of assessment, the best thing for you to do is take your own notes of the Prime Minister's speech and then listen to how your partner is engaging with that material. Decide whether or not they've engaged with it well, and if they have, great. And if they haven't, like, make a note in your own notes that that's something that you need to re-engage with. That's an argument that you need to make sure that you're definitely tackling in your speech. I mean, maybe they inadvertently strawman that person. The judges may care, and it's always best to be in the position of saying, look, they didn't successfully prove this, but even if they had proven this, we still think, you know, yada yada and so forth, right? So there's never it's never normally a disadvantage to try and correct for a perceived straw man whether or not the response coming from the LO was actually a straw man or not. So as daunting as it sounds, a lot of the material is going to come from the speech before you, and the judges will expect response to that material, right? Even if it's hard, they don't necessarily always appreciate how hard it is when they're judging. It's probably one of the reasons why judges should every so often go back and speak, just to remind themselves of how incredibly difficult it actually is to speak. But it means that you need to be thinking in terms of, when you're listening to that material, how can I turn my responses to this into substantive material that's going to answer the fundamentals of their claim. So I think that's pretty much all I've got to say. If you've got any additional questions, I could probably tack a little bit of video onto this. I think I was asked to clarify how you go about doing summation from deputy speeches. I hope we've already covered that to a reasonable degree. I think probably the question in terms of how it is you do it from a structural point of view is you probably wouldn't necessarily structure it the way you would actually structure a sum speech, which is to say you probably don't open the DLO speech saying, this debate has been about 3 things, especially because that implicitly limits your flexibility to be able to add extension material onto that. What you should do, particularly towards the end of the speech, is say, look, at the end of this top half, this debate came down to the following 2 issues, blah 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 and blah blah, and here's how we're winning on both. That kind of signals the judges that this is a substantive element to it that's attempting to draw a line under the top half and tells them, okay, here is how opening opposition feel that they are beating opening government, say. And as I've said, also useful to try and turn that into an agenda going forward later in the debate that you can say to the closing government team, look, here is the thing you need to be doing. You need to be fitting into this debate in this way in order to make the proposition still relevant, in order to be able to plug those gaps with opening government. It's your benefit, it's their benefit. They're probably going to throw opening government under the bus and take the bait rather than rejecting it. So it should hopefully work out well for both. And again, the model I think is probably best to look at in terms of a summation coming from DLO done very well. It's probably the DLO speech in the Manila World, so World 2012, Octo Final 1 from BPPA. Okay, so thanks very much for watching this workshop. I hope it was at least moderately helpful in parts.